Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started. Like many stories, it begins with a beautiful event where nobles have gathered. And if anyone were to ask who the most beautiful girl in that place was, most would immediately answer without hesitation that it was young Lady Agatha of the Cattle family. And then suddenly a man came up to her, holding out a handkerchief, and said that the pattern of her dress just matched the pattern of his handkerchief. The girl looked at him in surprise but accepted his item, but he said she dropped it by the bushes on the street corner. He noticed it and decided to give it back to her. This man was, in fact, incredibly beautiful, but he was like a knight on a white horse, and all the girls were fanatical about him. Agatha herself was overjoyed, but she tried to be restrained and simply took the handkerchief from the man, saying that that was right, it was her thing. She looked at him with a tender look and said that she was incredibly grateful to him, for it was a precious thing to her. However, once the girl thought she was in a romantic story, she quickly changed her mind. And all because immediately afterward the barbarians ran into their event. They were on horses and half naked. One of these men had an axe and asked that they pay a ransom or else they would trample them to death, and that is not a pleasant death. The man was running from side to side and saying that they needed money. The guests, who had been standing quietly all this time, immediately started running away in a panic, not realizing what was even happening and what they should do. Then Agatha immediately realized that this world would not be so joyful and peaceful, for she had entered the world of the game called Destiny of the Fallen. In fact, in this game, the girl fulfills the role of a very important character that is related to a quest called Lace Handkerchief. She is a young Lady Agatha Scott, and when people saw these bandits, they immediately knew they were from the Cripes, but they didn't understand how they could even get into the city in the middle of the day in broad daylight, and where was the security since they allowed it. Agatha herself was calmly watching and didn't even blink an eye when a huge barbarian with an axe ran past her. And all because absolutely every day all these events happen time after time without any change. Every day, Agatha hears all the same conversations, does the same actions, and sees the same thugs, so she's already learned every minute of what's going on. Therefore, thanks to the fact that she had experienced it more than once, she was not at all surprised when one of the barbarians suddenly grabbed her and said that she was the most beautiful woman, so he was taking her away. The men immediately laughed and said that she would surely give them a lot of love. Agatha herself had to play her part, crying and screaming for help. The girls who were standing nearby were crying too. They understood what they should do, but they knew very well that if Agatha was taken away now, she would lose her honor and innocence there, and that was incredibly cruel, even worse than death, in their opinion. One of the men who was just watching the whole thing started yelling about all the help and said she absolutely had to be saved. But he himself, of course, did not want to do anything, for he was very much afraid of these barbarians. But then suddenly a male voice came from the side and said that he was going to do something about it. It was a young guy with brightly colored hair. He was riding his horse, trying to stop the barbarians and save the girl. Of course, Agatha was not surprised by this, because everything from time to time repeats itself. A hero runs to her, whose sword is sure to save the beauty from the terrible fate that awaits her at the barbarians. And while the fight for the girl is going on, she hears again the same boring, harsh words that are unseemly to even utter to a lady. The barbarians did not immediately realize where the guy even came from, because he popped up unnoticed, but nevertheless defeated them. The girl had to play her part. She screamed and cried, saying that it was incredibly scary. In fact, she wished she could change a great deal about the story, for she thought these dialogues were as silly and unnecessary as possible. But she was only a character in this game, so she had no right to tell anyone what to do. That's why she had to go through all this over and over again. Well, after a while, she suddenly heard complete silence. Agatha was very surprised and started looking around, trying to figure out why everything had suddenly gone quiet. But as soon as she looked at the man who was covered in blood, she was immediately surprised, for there were many corpses lying around him. He had a bloody blade in his hand. Agatha was so surprised that she was ready to scream in terror, for something had gone completely wrong. In fact, in the storyline, These barbarians were supposed to squeeze out an escape back to their lair and then trigger new missions for the adventurers. But now, when she looked at all these people who wanted to steal her, they were dead. And the girl didn't understand how that was even possible, because several times in a row, everything was the same. But at that moment, the man turned around and started to walk closer to her. He was smiling even though his whole face was covered in blood. The so-called prince on the white horse told Agatha not to be afraid, for they would certainly not dare to bother her again. The girl didn't even have anything to say. She was shocked. After all, these bandits didn't even have a scale of health left. And how was it even possible to kill them in such a case? But here she suddenly immediately remembered her role in this game and made an innocent face, thinking that she had to follow the storyline. So the girl made her voice as calm as possible and addressed the knight, saying that to her his fearlessness and bravery had saved him from the claws of evil, and she could not express her gratitude in mere words. At that moment, Agatha knelt down and handed him a small piece of jewelry, saying that it was his reward for the mission. He was a brave traveler and deserved the best. She herself was glad that her mission at least continued and that it remained unchanged. For a while, the man only looked at this piece of jewelry, but then he said that there was nothing special about this necklace, so he certainly didn't need it. Agatha immediately removed her smile. She thought about the fact that if he didn't want jewelry, he didn't have to accept such a mission. It made her angry that he apparently didn't know that she could teleport while the mission was still pending. But at this moment, the man suddenly spoke with enthusiasm and said that if he didn't fulfill Agatha's mission, she probably wouldn't be able to return to the city. The girl lowered her head but didn't answer. She doesn't understand why he's asking all this, because he knows everything perfectly well. But he's probably looking for trouble. Unfortunately, she couldn't answer him with anything else but the hackneyed phrases that had been prescribed to her by the storyline. She's programmed, so she can't speak her mind. Then Agatha smiled and thanked him, telling him again that this necklace was for him in honor of his help. And even with this idiot, she still needs to keep smiling, playing her part. After all, if the adventurer doesn't complete her mission, she'll have to walk 15 minutes under the bright and blazing sun to get back to town on her own. She really doesn't know who decided to make such a horrible and evil storyline, but she can't do anything about it. Many people may be wondering why a regular character in this game can have so many complaints. Yes, all because she realized a long time ago that she was not the real Lady Agatha, as she was claimed. But as an ordinary player in the game, it took her a very long time to accept the fact that her memories of her childhood, her parents, her whole life before that, was just an ordinary story that the author had made up. She really believed that she had a life before, and that she was something important in this world. But it turned out not to be true. And very often, Agatha began to try many different ways to get a glimpse of the outside world. But that world is too big to find a way out of. And at certain times of the night, wherever Agatha is, she finds herself back in her bedroom. But in simple terms, she is simply restarting her story. And every day the girl thinks about when it will all end, and when finally will come the end of her story. Because so far she certainly has no brightenings. Oh, and on top of that, a great many guys come to her and don't take the reward in order to take advantage of her time and attention without finally finishing the mission. She was silent for a while with the man standing next to her, and he then said that he had worked very hard on this quest, but since he wasn't seeing the reward, what the point was there, he didn't know. The guy turned to Agatha and asked if she would really do that to him. The girl was incredibly angry, but she couldn't even show these emotions. All the time she had to smile like a character. Well, then the man suddenly waved his head and said that in that case he would choose the award he wanted. He took something out of his inside pocket. It was a small ring. The boy knelt down in front of Agatha and asked if she would mind listening to him. When the girl saw all this, she was incredibly surprised, and the man looked her straight in the eye and held out his ring and asked her to marry him. Agatha was so surprised that she couldn't even utter a word. Birds were singing around them, and the setting was romantic enough, but she felt no feelings. The girl looked at this stranger in surprise, not realizing if he was even all right and how he could offer her such a thing. But at that moment, a window of choice suddenly popped up in front of Agatha that she had never had before. When the girl looked at it, she didn't really have a choice as such. There was only one answer option, to which it was written that she agreed. The girl looked at the man in surprise, and after that she shifted her gaze to the pop-up window and didn't understand what was even going on. Agatha didn't know where that selection window had come from in the first place, and assumed it was probably some kind of bug in the system. But what confused her the most was that there was only one answer choice, and there was no way to close that window, no way to reject it, no way to do anything with it except agree. Her hands suddenly began to shake, and she realized that she couldn't even move, no matter how much the girl tried to step back or move at least her head. She couldn't. Her body seemed to freeze. Agatha was so worried that she was ready to scream, not realizing what was even going on and not knowing what she should do now. And at the same time, various phrases that she could read suddenly began to appear around her. However, there were so many of them that she couldn't even distinguish a single one. The girl did not understand why everything was happening like this. Then she shifted her gaze to the man who, with a smile on his face, continued to stand waiting for her answer with the ring in his hands. It was only now that she was suddenly beginning to wonder who he even was and why exactly things had gotten so strange with him. For some time longer the man was silent, but then he turned to Lady Agatha and said that she was a very good-natured and kind-hearted girl. That's why he hopes she doesn't leave him with a broken heart when he suddenly puts his head down and says that maybe, certainly he's wrong, but a man hopes for the best. He continued to hold the ring, and the girl did not answer him anything. Then the man asked if perhaps his proposal was not so sincere for her. Agatha thought at this point about what would happen if she refused his offer, and assumed that she would probably just be killed like those brigands, and she wasn't sure if they would ever be revived. Then suddenly her hands began to shake and she remained silent, the man watching her reaction carefully. And after a while he apologized, saying that his suggestion would probably seem too rude and sudden to her. But still he turned to Lady Agatha and said that she meant too much to him, and he needed her as much as people need water, air, and food. Agatha tried not to listen to him much at this point. After all, she had her own problems to deal with, and all because the panel in front of her hadn't disappeared. And that meant she could only agree to the proposal. The boy, however, kept insisting. He had blood even in his hair, and he said, smiling, that he hoped that someday she would be able to see the sincerity and immensity of his love for her. However, the girl most of all was not going to marry the first man she met, so he also killed a lot of people without even making much of an effort. That made her doubly horrified. But the man still insisted. He called her a beautiful lady and asked her to accept his proposal, because he wanted to commit his life to her. Agatha thought about what to do for a while, but then she realized that she didn't have much of a choice, so she said that she agreed to his proposal. The man, when he heard this, was overjoyed. He took her hand and began to put a ring on it, saying that he could say without a doubt that Agatha was the kindest angel in the whole world. And she, in the generosity of her soul, did not condemn him to suffer from unrequited love. He is insanely grateful to her for that. Soon he put a beautiful engagement ring on her ring finger and told her it was all wonderful. Agatha touched her hand at that moment, realizing that thanks to this ring she could finally move again. But the man, still smiling, said that the ring suited her very well. The girl in turn continued to study this jewelry because it seemed incredibly familiar to her. And then after some time of thinking about it, she remembered where she might have seen that ring before, and it scared her straight. And all because these are the rings that fall out of low-ranked monsters. So you can find them anywhere. It's easy to buy on the streets of the city. You can also, this ring has no value whatsoever. You can buy it for cheap anywhere on any given day. Tons of them are brought to the market. And that's what made her most angry, because she is an aristocrat. And this man dared to propose to her with such a horrible and low-grade ring, and she had to agree to it, because the game did not give her any other choice. But at that moment, a strong wind suddenly blew, and the pearls that were in the girl's hair suddenly even shattered. She also smelled a strange odor, and saw ashes all around her. Agatha was very surprised and didn't understand what it was. Then she decided to turn around to see where the ash was coming from. But when she turned to the side, she didn't see anything like that. The man at that moment jumped on his horse and said that the wind was getting stronger, so he wanted to walk her home, and also at the end, smiling, he called her his bride. After a while, Agatha's fiancé took her in his arms and held her by the waist so that she would not fall, and the girl put her arms around his neck. They were so close together that she could even feel his heartbeat, and that worried the girl. As they drove straight toward the castle, Agatha suddenly looked to the side and saw that some of the petals had been blown straight towards her because of the strong wind. She saw some of the bouquets that were growing along the road and noticed that something strange was happening to them. The girl, looking more closely, noticed that the color of these roses showed that they were just taking and withering. When it was already completely dark outside, the guy and the girl finally arrived at her estate. She was very tired, so she even slept for a while. And so, when Agatha could already see the walls of her castle, she noticed that the streets were too empty, which was not typical for such a beautiful evening, which was very warm. She was a little wary, but when she looked back up, she noticed something strange. It was as if everything around her had changed and was even darker. Agatha guessed that this is most likely what the new version of the game is. Some talk about the fact that the developers have hidden access to data about the new version. These materials can open only those players who have completed all the key story quests. For 3 years, a lot of players have been trying to get information about this part of the game all over the world, looking for more and more new quests to get to this place. Everyone wanted to be the lucky one who would be the first to unlock access to the new, more improved and interesting version, and in order to get the most unique titles and mystical rewards, they had to make many sacrifices. However, Agatha didn't understand how the most ordinary player like her could relate to all this. There is no such thing, because the most important law of games is that the main characters always get to new worlds, and the ordinary ones are the last ones to be left behind. She sighed heavily and decided to thank the man for helping her. She looked at him and said, "Thank you for giving her a ride as well." Agatha wanted to get off his arm, saying that she should probably go now, but the man refused to let her do so in a firm and decisive voice. The girl generally thought that he probably didn't even hear her, but she still wanted to thank him sincerely so that he would notice her politeness and ethics. But when she heard his refusal, she was very surprised. The man looked her straight in the face and, smiling, told her that very soon they would be going on another journey that would be even more important than this one. And whatever happens to them next, he wants the girl to be able to trust him. Agatha stared into his beautiful ruby-colored eyes and just couldn't give it up. But what really surprised her the most was that he answered her at all. That meant that he could hear her, but she didn't understand how that was possible, since normal players could only communicate with others in a scripted way, and she had spoken her own thoughts. The girl was very frightened by what had happened. Everything had become completely different, and she did not understand how to live now. The people who lived in this game world were very surprised. After all, they too had learned that someone had launched a new version of the game. In fact, they were just thrilled, because it had been a whole 3 years since it had last been done. No one could find it, not even the biggest nerds. It was so well hidden that it took a lot of work. Then suddenly one of the guys came in and said that he had just been in the dungeon and didn't understand where it had suddenly teleported him to. He was very upset that he had thus lost his legendary sword that he was supposed to get there. But then suddenly the king's courtier, a man named Otto Dexon, came into the hall. He looked very handsome and rich. When the players saw this, they immediately began to whisper, for this was part of the main quest they had yet to complete. Otto addressed them, saying that he was sorry to tell them all this, but their beloved and respected ruler had sadly passed away. And since Prince Leon was the king's only heir, he died of fever years ago, and according to the law of the city, they have 7 contenders to be the next heir to the throne. When all the guests heard this, they were horrified and began to accuse the man of cheating. But at that moment, the door suddenly opened, and Agatha and the young man entered the room. Her future fiancé said that no one was fooling them and that only one person could be the rightful heir. Agatha in turn stood behind him and looked out, not realizing what was going on or how they were in this place, since they were on their way to her estate. But at that moment, a man came around her from the other side, and kneeling before her, addressed her as Her Majesty, the Queen. Agatha, when she heard all this, she was even confused. She didn't understand why he was doing this, or who all these people who had gathered around were. The guests present were themselves surprised. One of the ladies did not understand who this girl was, where she had come from, and why the man was calling her queen. The guy who was standing next to her said he saw her as a regular character from the Lace Handkerchief quest, so he has absolutely no idea what she's doing in that place. A strong wind continued to rage outside, blowing rose petals all over the street. There was even a thunderstorm, but it still hadn't rained. Agatha stood in the midst of all the unfamiliar characters, who were looking at her in surprise and talking about something. Everyone was confused. She sighed heavily and wanted to say something to her future fiancé, but suddenly a window appeared in front of her face again. The girl immediately shifted her gaze there and saw that it was her character's life story. It said that when Queen Mary, the king's first wife, died in the convent of the Holy Spirit, Princess Agatha was born. Immediately afterward, the king wanted to marry a new woman. So he decided to give his motherless daughter to the Viscount Cattle in the spring of the 12th year of the new calendar. Agatha Maria Kersaville, Henry Ignatius Venetia Helios, who had a full right to the throne according to the Cossack Act passed in the 3rd year of the new calendar, became the only and entirely suitable heiress. And that's why she has the right to accept the title of Queen of the Year of Venus and the Kingdom of Helios. Then suddenly Otto, who had been silent all this time, spoke up. He said that it was a hidden clue that no one had found yet about Lady Agatha's identity and status. The guests immediately turned in his direction, not realizing whether he really meant it. The man, in turn, smiled and said that they turned out to be true without any doubt. Agatha was suddenly very nervous, thinking about the fact that this was all working out, that she was now queen. The other people, however, when they heard about it, were shocked. They didn't understand how she could pass this royal way, for it was very unexpected. One of the guests present generally thought that the quest about the monastery of the Holy Ghost would end when they took away the coffin of the queen, but it turned out to be quite the opposite. Another girl suddenly spoke up, saying that she had never even noticed that the print on Queen Mary's dress and Lady Agatha's were very similar. Agatha herself continued to stand silently with her eyes down, not realizing what was going to happen to her. But now it was clear to her and herself how true the hidden plot of the game was, because they had just been prompted. This means that the guy himself found the right clues, went through all the quests, opened access to the new version, and even found it. She shifted her gaze to the ring that flaunted on her ring finger, and realized that his marriage proposal was also part of the quest. But Agatha still didn't understand how he could have answered her then, and assumed it was more likely that he had actually heard and understood her, and was aware of the existence of his own self rather than prescribed lines. The girl immediately guessed that an ordinary player who had his own thoughts would become a sensation among everyone, and she wondered very much if this man would tell anyone about it. Agatha knew that if she got too much extra attention, something bad could happen, like the fact that she would simply be removed because of some interference, and she would dissolve among the many numbers and formulas, the creation of this game. But she quickly pushed those thoughts away because he hadn't said anything back to her, so it was probably a mistake. It could happen, and they'd probably just misunderstood each other. But Agatha also remembered that there were players who liked to talk to her about something other than the main quest. They are also called students with 8th grade syndrome, so she assumed that this man must be of that sort. The girl sighed heavily and realized that as she read the game chat, she had learned a lot about the real world that the players were playing from. She turned the other way and felt very sad, because Agatha wanted more than anything to be in a place where you could be angry or sad, where you could laugh when you wanted to, and express yourself. She really wondered what it would be like to express her own thoughts and feelings instead of speaking in memorized lines. The girl would really like to live a real life, not the life of some minor character that has been repeated time after time. But at that moment, the other players, when they heard all this, they were very surprised. One of the men said that he hadn't noticed anything special about that piece of cloth, so he had spent a lot of time on the quest with the Duke, and it turned out he hadn't needed it at all. The other guy opened the task menu and said he understood it perfectly well, because in general the quest in Hallsberg was going on at this time. Others complained about constantly collecting resources in Prince Royce's territory, all of which ended up being useless, much to the annoyance of the players. Agatha stood silent at that moment, and she felt incredibly ashamed, because she knew that it was all because of her. But she couldn't even apologize because she was just a character who had all the lines written down. The players didn't understand why this was even the case. After all, before, there was no hint that Lady Agatha might step into the path of a queen. And here they finally got the legendary sword quest, and it just took off. One of the guys got so frustrated that he even said that the game is rolled and it's all just a dump, so he doesn't want to play it anymore. When Agatha heard that, it made her even sadder, but she didn't know what it was all for, what the point of her existence even was. But then, the blonde-haired man who had brought her to this place suddenly spoke, saying that from now on, Venus City would enter the age of the Queen, and bowed right in front of her. But as the plot was about to continue, the great Wagner spoke up, saying that even if this girl is actually Queen Mary's daughter, it doesn't make any sense. He was outraged, for she had not been raised by any of the heirs of the kingdom and therefore could not rule. The Earl Horb also intervened in this conversation, saying that he didn't know what she would do if she had to face the great army of the Northern Empire, or if there was an uprising of the people, because a little girl like Lady Agatha would only cry on the sidelines, unable to solve such global problems. People felt that their kingdom needed a stronger monarch, and this damsel could hardly quite figure it out. When one of the people in the audience said that in order to be a good ruler, she should at least show everyone what she could do, Agatha was even more upset when she heard this, because it hurt her. She was silent the whole time, even if she wanted to answer, and didn't understand why she had absolutely no lines in this story, and how she could just stand there and endure all this humiliation from people. But at that moment, some man suddenly turned to them all admiringly, telling them to look, for there was some new list of tasks. Even after reading all these conditions, one of the guys said that now he understood everything. Their past quests didn't go anywhere. It's just that they need to finish this story quest first, and then they can come back. He also said that they could choose the next ruler of Venus on their own, and it's a very delightful video of the plot turning into a battle for the throne. Then a friend of another with elf ears spoke up, and said there they give a reward for the quest of the 7 kingdoms. There were a lot of different rewards for this quest, which attracted players very much. But at that moment, one of the men suddenly looked at Agatha, who changed dramatically. When the guy screamed, everyone immediately looked in her direction and saw that a health scale had appeared above the girl's head. When the girl herself lifted her head up and saw the numbers there, she was very surprised. She realized that it was the end, because people would kill everyone in the hall, and most likely there would be no one left alive in the game. Agatha was very upset and didn't know what to do. The people started to look around and noticed that they themselves had life levels above their heads. Then suddenly one of the men grabbed his weapon, shouting that there was no way he was going to let this little wench control the geolus only over his dead body. It could happen. The other people thought about the fact that if they didn't have a definitively confirmed queen, it meant that everyone had an equal chance at the throne. So they were going to fight for the title of ruler like in the past. Some of them also said that they could never know their true calling, but as long as they knew the pretender to the role of queen, they would leave her no opportunity to actually be crowned. Others asked why they didn't just push her into the abyss. They came closer and closer to Agatha, and even apologized to her. The girl, for her part, just stood there. She didn't know what to do in such a situation, so she decided that she should just wait for her fate to be eliminated. But then the girl thought about the fact that it wasn't even hers after all. She had never tried to aspire to it, and none of this was even her fault. The title of queen has nothing to do with her. It's someone else's destiny. Then suddenly one of the men spoke up, saying that it was a pity that the lace handkerchief task would probably disappear after the game update. After all, he used to touch her body a lot before. But seeing the surprised faces of his partners, he asked if they didn't know that she could be ordered to undress if she didn't fulfill her duties. It opens with some very embarrassing and cute dialogue. In fact, when Agatha rewatched this game again when she fell for this man, She held out the necklace to him, thanking him for saving her. But he in turn said that her soul was beautiful, and her case even better, and as a reward for her help, he wanted more than just a necklace. So he asked that the girl undress. Agatha played her part, and turning away began to cover her dress with her hands so he wouldn't dare touch her. But the man came closer and closer and said that the cheat code worked after all, and the dress could indeed be removed. Then he asked if she would let him unbutton it, and seeing her frightened face, he asked why she was so unhappy, because it would be very pleasant. Agatha, ready in her turn even to cry, began to realize that she could not resist, and that meant there was nothing she could do. But the girl only knew that no one should see her like this. However, the only retort to her part was for him to be gentle. The girl was annoyed that everything in this world was created only to satisfy their vile needs, and she was just an ordinary doll used to fulfill men's desires. Of course, having dignity of one's own is too much of a luxury for ordinary characters. And what kind of dignity and honor can we talk about if ordinary characters like Agatha can't even dream about it? Except Agatha wants that luxury badly, whether it's life or dignity. She wants to have the same rights as everyone else. The girl no longer wants to be a little girl who only cries and is unable to protect herself. Agatha had spent her whole life trying to do her best to gain this paltry freedom, but it was all to no avail. In fact, after the quest to rescue Agatha, players receive her shawl, with which they go to the Holy Spirit Monastery to complete the next quest. They need to uncover the girl's story, and also decide whether to become a follower of Princess Agatha. But as with all stories, there is one moment. Princess Agatha had absolutely no need for all these people. She didn't want to give up this precious freedom, so she didn't give her handkerchief to anyone. So all the time the girl was giving her saviors a necklace as a token of gratitude, even though she should have been giving a completely different one. The boys, as they looked at her, thought the whole thing strange. After all, they had been squatting for so long, cleaning Lady Agatha's handkerchief, and did not understand why this quest was being completed without further tasks. His partner agreed and said to check again the next day. Maybe some stealthy errands would show up. Agatha, for her part, continued to stand, and even waved goodbye to them. The girl thought about the fact that their quest had been completed, and she could safely teleport them back. The men, as they walked away, wondered what other assignments there might even be for an ordinary character who didn't have much of a role. So it's very unlikely. And now, as Agatha stood in front of all these people, she thought about how she absolutely did not want to be removed. So the girl is going to send them all away for a long time. She doesn't want to adjust to someone's wishes and lose her life because of it. But at that moment, the girl looked to the side and saw that the guy who had brought her to this place and asked her to marry him was looking straight at her without averting his gaze. For a while, Agatha just stood there, thinking that he would probably have to help her, but the man didn't even move. She in turn remembered his words about believing him, whatever happened, of course. Agatha, like a naive girl, had trusted him and said that she would always be on his side. It was part of the plot, so you can get to know the queen better and open new chapters, which means she can use those combat settings too. At this moment, Agatha used her abilities to conjure up her fiancé's sword and pumped his level to the maximum. She really wanted him not to let her down as a result, and the man in turn jumped down from where he was standing, moving closer to Agatha. The man turned, asking if he was correct in his understanding that she needed to get rid of people from other units to protect her followers in this great and interesting battle for the throne. When the warriors present saw the man and his weapon, they were very surprised. They did not understand who he was or why he was doing this. But then suddenly one of the players looked at the taskbar again and said that there was a secret hidden title in this place, which showed that there was a single title in the world of Fate of the Fallen that was constantly changing and could not be recognized once and for all. But Agatha's fiancé walked up to one of the earls and without a second thought blew his head off without even blinking an eye. He had already stepped aside when people saw it and started screaming, not understanding what was even going on or why he did it. Then they noticed his weapons, and one of the players said that they were the same legendary swords from the last version, but they didn't understand why it looked completely different. Then one of the players hesitated and said that he didn't know if a legendary sword could kill many ordinary players with a single strike. But at that moment, a man who was her fiancé named Carl came up to her and bowed to her, called her his queen, and said he was very devoted to her. If Agatha succeeds in becoming queen, then according to the past storyline, the next step is that she will take the throne of the domain. From that moment, the city of Venus will enter an era of unprecedented darkness. Agatha Maria will become a narcissistic and lustful witch, as well as an evil ruler. Agatha thought about all of this and realized that it's not surprising that a girl like that would only annoy everyone. But she's not like that herself. But she didn't understand why it somehow applied to her at all. For a while, she simply remained silent, as did everyone else present, and then turning to the people, she asked, "Do they really want her to prove that she is capable of ruling the kingdom?" No one dared to say anything. People were still in shock after what had happened to one of the counts. His head, by the way, no one had ever removed. Agatha was also silent for a while, and then said that she didn't even know if it was even possible to prove it to them in any way. The girl then turned to her beloved fiancé Carl and asked that he kill all the traitors who are trying to create a plan to destroy the city. The man stood with a smug smile on his face for a while, but then he suddenly thought about the sword the girl had given him. Carl thought about how this game was getting more and more interesting as time went on. So he grabbed his weapon and said he would definitely do her bidding. And then, thinking long and hard, the man went straight into battle. A great deal of blood splattered around, and it was not very pleasant to look at it all. Agatha looked down and thought about the fact that if they left town and it rained, there was no need to come back. Every player knows that Lady Agatha doesn't show up in town when the weather is bad. But no one cares where the average player is at this time. And she herself was actually online the whole time until 2 in the morning. All this was before the girl woke up in a strange world. Looking around, she didn't realize where she was. There were a lot of different numbers and formulas around that she didn't understand. The girl assumed it was some kind of magic, and thought it was the place where her destiny would be shown. Agatha thought that this was the place where she could finally find out what the future held. And she did. She saw her dead and bloody body clearly in front of her, with a sword stuck in it. The end of her life she will meet on the throne, and her crown will fall in a pool of her own blood. People will only scoff and pretend to be truly sorry. But in fact, they would be incredibly happy, because they finally got it, and they also asked that her body not be touched, and left to a man who already has blood on his hands. That's what her killer said. Agatha is now very afraid that this is how it will end up if she doesn't do anything about it. She is just like all other people, with greedy, selfish, disgusting, and cowardly souls. But she doesn't think it can end on the first chapter, so she needs time and preparation. It's been a while. She apologized to the developers for everything, but she had actually stolen a magic spell. Agatha still needed someone who wouldn't kill her under any circumstances. She needed strong and loyal followers, so she pointed Carl to her ring, and he of course had to be on her side. She imagined him walking with the sword, and realized that it would all be quite simple. The girl selected the sword in a special panel, and enhanced its combat value. It went well enough. It's just that it's unexpected for Agatha. The thing is, when this player showed up, he was too strong. Carl is wearing all the gear and weapons except the sword. Moreover, he is much taller than everyone else, and he doesn't need to fight for that reward. Therefore, Agatha already doubted that this guy was really the most ordinary player. Soon after the guy had completed all the quests, he received a reward for the quest. A special title. Agatha, watching all of this, thought to herself that she would have to study this further. For now, she should savor her victory. At that moment, Carl walked over to the small cushion on which the crown stood. The man took it and held it out to the girl. She didn't even look at it, thinking that everything that had happened that day had nothing to do with Lady Agatha. This girl is just a character. The person who deleted that data and changed the world is a player. As for his sword, it is most likely a common bug in the system. Charles bowed before Her Highness, presenting her with a crown, and asked that she accept support from their chief followers. Agatha looked him over carefully from head to toe, and realized that, judging by the expensive weapons and fancy equipment, he had spent a lot of money and effort. Yes, and such people should be treated with special attention, and they should never be offended in any way. But the girl was more interested in another question right now, namely who she was in general. She knew her name, but at the same time it was also the name of a character in the game. Then suddenly something very unusual happened, and a notice appeared in front of the other players that the North was preparing for an emergency technical check of the system, and they were also sorry for the inconvenience. The players were very upset because there were only 5 minutes left before the server closed. They did not understand what was going on and why they were not warned in advance. People didn't understand how to even understand it. After all, many people had just started the main quest. Agatha also saw the countdown, but she didn't react to it. People in turn did not understand why this technical check was needed right now, but someone suggested that it was probably because the first chapter had ended and the second was about to open. Someone was very surprised to hear this and asked how could it be so fast. After all, they said that the first chapter would be a few months away, and he hadn't even gotten to the bottom of the plot yet. Agatha's hands suddenly began to shake, for she didn't know what was happening. There had never been such inspections before, especially not so urgent and for no reason. The countdown was accelerating, and there wasn't much time left. And the girl still didn't know why now, what would happen next, and what all the characters should even expect to happen to their world. Her emotions so overwhelmed her body that she couldn't even stand on her feet. So she sat down on the throne that was behind her. All the things Agatha had worked so hard for, it all ended up being useless. Some technical check of the server started, and all players were asked to wait for its completion. Also apologized for the inconvenience caused. Soon afterward, it became quite quiet around. Many people disappeared, and only Agatha and Carl, who was standing beside her, remained. The girl was very surprised. Then she turned to the man, saying that all the players had already been disconnected, and wondered why there was still someone left on this server. But Carl only smiled and asked Her Highness if she was all right. When she heard his voice, she was very frightened, and wondered if he could really hear and understand her, for she was not speaking in lines now, but in her own thoughts. But the guy kept smiling, said that of course he could hear her, and could do whatever his sweet lady Agatha said. The girl was ready to shout with joy, for she realized that she had not imagined it at all, and that she had indeed been right. She looked at the man and wondered if he had heard her all this time. Carl bowed to her gently, and said that Lady Agatha's voice was so beautiful that he wanted every word to be inscribed on his heart. He can't forget them, can't forget her sensitive and delicate voice. He can't help the urge to kneel at her feet to memorize her every word. Agatha, hearing these words, was incredibly surprised. She didn't understand what was happening to him, and assumed that he had gone mad because of some mistake. But then she suddenly thought about it, and wondered if he wasn't a regular player, since there was a technical check going on right now, and he was supposed to disappear with the rest of the people. Carl was silent for a while. After that, looking somewhere in the distance, he said that the technical test is really a very pathetic excuse. The developers just don't know how to deal with it. That's why they called it that. He smirked and said in a quieter voice that it was the easiest thing to do, and he hadn't guessed anything from the beginning, so his plans had been successfully realized. Agatha suddenly rose from her seat and stepped closer to him, wondering how he had managed to get around the system at all. The man replied that he had learned her data through the character file, then wondered in surprise if she didn't know that all of her information was in just one file, and that she was just an ordinary program. Agatha felt a little uneasy, and she asked in a shaky voice what it was all about and what he was talking about. She wondered if it was something bad. Carl replied in a serious voice that of course it was bad, and asked if she knew the difference at all between a regular character and living people. Oh, the girl immediately said she didn't know and wondered what the difference was. She said she was just a robot who had no choice between good and evil. The people who play as the characters, on the other hand, can make their own decisions. They will always be evil and mean, and she doesn't even know it. These creepy creatures will do anything for money. Neither words nor good deeds will change their minds. When Agatha heard all this, she was very surprised. She said in a trembling voice that she didn't know what he was talking about. To this, Carl explained that it all meant that they didn't want to seriously pursue her storyline with her. Unlike Duke Bugner or other key characters, She's just a regular player, and none of the other players will want to spend time on her. That's why they don't want her alive. There are so many bounties being offered for her head right now. Carl said they created a gentle, sweet lady to begin with. Then they would make her stumble and go the other way, and finally die in front of thousands of people. The so-called doom, the destruction of the beauty around her, the eternal drama that never ends. But Agatha wondered why he was even telling her all this, and why he wanted her to know it. The girl really couldn't understand anything. She had wanted to know a lot of things before, but now she just wanted to protect her life. The man raised his sword in her direction and said that of course Her Highness Agatha was very important. He was so tired of all this overplaying, he had grander ideas. The girl saw him pointing his sword in her direction. Carl said that he could safely eliminate all unnecessary characters, and that was pretty good. He said that people who run away from the real world and its problems are still inexperienced even when they come to the virtual world, and he finds that quite ironic. But Carl also said that you have to have immortal powers to kill off all the mediocre characters, and he doubts anything would work without them. However, if you don't kill them off, they will be hostage to endless boredom and monotony in the plot. The main point, however, is that as the initiator of the prologue, he cannot kill his partner and fiancé, Queen Agatha. Alas, those are the rules, and unfortunately he can't get around them at all. Carl smiled and said that even though there are rules in the game, there are no rules in the real world. Therefore, he has complete freedom. After all, he called her his queen. Agatha, all shaking with fear, tried to make her voice more even and asked if the developers wouldn't come back to sort it out. Do a check and find the bug. And even if he takes and kills all the mediocre characters, he certainly won't be able to change the world that way. She will stand up to the end and stand up to him no matter what. The girl mustered up her courage and started screaming, saying that she would live forever and would not let any of this happen. All his actions are completely meaningless. Carl smiled lightly and said that now he knew what the girl was most worried about, and asked if she really cared. Agatha's confidence began to fade, and she told herself that everything would be fine, but she didn't understand why her excitement wouldn't subside. The girl wasn't sure if this Carl couldn't kill her. At that time, she began to hear some voices. She couldn't see anything, but somehow Carl was able to transmit the sound to her. They were outraged people whose game tab had suddenly disappeared from their computer, and they didn't know how to get their old account back, on which they had already accomplished a lot. Many men were even going to go to a service and check their computer. They didn't understand how it happened that all the data just disappeared, and even the backup didn't work. A lot of people tried to re-download the game. After that, to log into the account, but all of them failed. People considered it a real tragedy. They just couldn't physically and emotionally stay in the real world. There was nothing else. That was the end of it. All data was lost forever. Even the backup CD had disappeared somewhere and could not be restored. All the copies that the players had made just evaporated. Fans of this game did not understand who did such a thing and asked to call the police because they did not know how to fix it. They didn't think it was a joke because they were annoyed that they couldn't get all their data back. Carl suddenly erased all the picture that was around them and turned it all into numbers. Then he started showing the various people who had played the game and were now just desperate because they couldn't get back in. The man turned to Agatha and said that unfortunately the blood was barren. She could never be a real person, which is why he named this world after Destiny. She has been banished to another virtual world that is similar to the real one, but also completely different. There are no creators or developers in this place, as in ordinary games. He said that the name was her, and all the characters that were around were only made up by her. Agatha, when she heard all this, just kept silent. She didn't know what to say in such a situation.